The Whispering Abyss. Chapter 1. The Eclipsing Madness. It was in the year 1923, when the world was trembling at the edges of a new and terrible age, that I, Dr. Lionel Carver, a man once devoted to the pursuit of reason and scientific inquiry, came to be entangled in the ghastly and incomprehensible forces that I dare not fully name. My tale begins in the desolate hills of western Massachusetts, a land steeped in antiquity and sorrow, where the winds howl like ancient voices across the barren fields, and the very earth seems to groan under the weight of forgotten and unspeakable memories. I had long been intrigued by the whispers of arcane knowledge that occasionally reached the academic circles of Boston, though I dismissed most of them as superstitions or the fanciful creations of cranks. Yet, on a particularly fog-choked evening in late autumn, I came upon a most curious letter, a missive from an old acquaintance named Professor Ezekiel Thorne. We had been colleagues during my years at Miskatonic University, though I had not heard from him in nearly a decade. His letter was cryptic, even for him, and it spoke of a discovery that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality itself. Carver, the letter began, I have found it. I know what they were trying to hide from us all these years. You must come at once. There is no time to waste. The professor's handwriting had deteriorated in quality, and the letter itself smelled faintly of mildew and decay, as though it had been submerged in some foul and murky pool for a number of weeks. His signature, once bold and decisive, now seemed feeble, almost as though his mind had begun to slip away even before the ink dried. Despite the unsettling tone of the letter, my scientific curiosity could not be stilled. I felt an inexplicable compulsion to visit him, to peer into whatever dark corner of human knowledge he had stumbled upon, for surely it was knowledge that no sane man should possess. I packed my bags the very next day and made my way to the remote village of Dunwich, where Thorne had taken residence in a dilapidated manor on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, its former occupants having vanished under circumstances that were never fully explained. Yet Thorne had returned, or rather, he had been drawn there, as I would soon come to understand. It was a place where the veil between our world and something far darker, far more alien, was thinner than I had ever dared to believe. Upon my arrival, I found the professor in a state of profound agitation. His once orderly, meticulous nature had devolved into a frantic, almost delirious mania. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to be forever searching the shadows as if some unseen presence were watching us. He was gaunt, his face drawn and pale, and the dark circles beneath his eyes suggested a man who had not slept in days, perhaps weeks. He greeted me with little ceremony, simply pulling me into the manor with an almost desperate urgency. The house itself, despite its crumbling state, seemed to hum with a quiet, almost imperceptible vibration, as if the very air around it were charged with some unnatural energy. "You must see it, Carver," Thorne rasped, his voice shaking with a fervor I had never before witnessed. "The manuscript, it was hidden away, buried in the vaults of Miskatonic, but I found it, Carver. I found it, and now the sky." His words trailed off into a fit of coughs, and he motioned for me to follow him upstairs. I could hear the distinct sound of something scratching against the walls, an unnatural noise that seemed to echo from within the very bones of the house itself. But I paid it little mind, for I had not yet begun to grasp the enormity of what lay ahead. Chapter 2. The Silent Scriptures. We entered a dimly lit study, its walls lined with shelves overflowing with books and papers. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the light of the dying fire in the hearth cast long, flickering shadows across the room. On a large oak desk in the center of the room sat a single object, a leather-bound manuscript, ancient and weathered, with strange symbols etched into its cover. The very sight of it filled me with a sense of unease, though I could not place why. "This," Thorne whispered, as if speaking of some sacred relic, "is the Codex of Alhura, It was written by a civilization that existed long before humanity, an intelligence so vast, so incomprehensible, that its very existence shatters the foundations of all we know. I stared at the manuscript, feeling a coldness creeping into my bones. The professor's words did not register immediately. Instead, my mind was consumed by an odd sensation, a vertigo, as though the room itself were tilting. The shadows cast by the flickering fire seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching out toward the manuscript as if they had a will of their own. But I shook the feeling off and approached the desk. "Where did you find it?" I asked, my voice betraying the first hints of apprehension. Thorn's eyes flickered toward the corner of the room, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. "In the depths of the Miskatonic archives. There are things there, Carver. Horrible things. Things that were meant to remain forgotten. This manuscript was not meant for human eyes." He paused, and I could see his fingers twitching nervously, as if reluctant to continue. But then, as though compelled by some unseen force, he reached forward and slowly opened the book, revealing pages upon pages of strange, alien script. The writing was utterly foreign to any language I had ever encountered, and yet, as I gazed at it, I felt a cold, eerie understanding creeping into my mind. The symbols danced before my eyes like living things, shifting and coiling in ways that defied the laws of reason. "These are the words of the Alhura," Thorn continued, his voice now a hoarse whisper. "They speak of beings beyond the stars, creatures whose forms are not of flesh, but of pure thought. They dwell in the spaces between worlds, in the black voids where time and space collapse into one. They are eternal, and they have watched over us since the beginning of time." I felt a cold sweat break out across my brow. The very air in the room seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though it were saturated with the weight of an ancient, malignant presence. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard a sound, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come not from the earth, but from the very sky above. It was as though some cosmic force were stirring, awakening from a long and terrible slumber. Thorn was trembling now, his eyes wide with terror. "They are coming, Carver. They have always been here. The eclipse is near, and when it happens, the veil will be torn open. We will see them, and we will be. He could not finish the thought. At that moment, the room plunged into darkness as the last embers of the fire sputtered out. An oppressive, choking silence followed, broken only by the faint sound of scratching. An eerie, otherworldly noise that seemed to vibrate within the very walls of the manor. And then, in the stillness, I heard something far worse than mere noise. I heard a voice, an alien, incomprehensible voice that echoed in my mind, not through my ears. It whispered a name that should not have been uttered in any sane world. Alhura. Chapter 3. The Madness Unbound. The next few hours? Or was it days? Time had become increasingly irrelevant, or blurred in my memory, as though they had been devoured by the very darkness I had been drawn into. I recall stumbling away from the manuscript, my head spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to speak, but no words came. I tried to move, but my limbs felt as though they had been frozen by some unseen force. Thorn was gone. The study was empty, save for the manuscript, which now lay open on the desk, its pages fluttering as though stirred by an unseen wind. The shadows in the room had grown deeper, stretching and writhing with a malevolent energy that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The scratching sound was louder now, reverberating through the walls as if something were trying to break free from within. And then, in the dead silence of the room, I heard the voice again, called to me, not in words, but in sensations, in thoughts that twisted and contorted within my mind. I could feel it probing me, searching for something, some weakness, some crack in the armor of my sanity. It showed me visions, horrible, incomprehensible visions of endless, swirling voids, of vast cosmic entities whose forms defied all human understanding. I saw galaxies being devoured by a monstrous, formless maw, and stars extinguished in the blink of an eye. But worst of all, I saw the faces of the Alhura. They were not beings of flesh, but of darkness, of thought, of pure thought, and their eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were pits of endless, writhing blackness that seemed to pull everything into them, everything and everyone. The madness had begun. Chapter 4. The Abyss Gazes Back. I had no clear memory of what transpired in the hours after the voice that was no voice, whispered its eldritch truths into my mind. The coldness that had pervaded the manor became an all-encompassing frost, numbing my thoughts and freezing my very soul. It was as though the universe itself had drawn a veil over my perception, and I was left in the shadows, a mere spectator to the horrors that unfolded in the dark recesses of reality. I awoke, or thought I awoke, still seated at the desk where the manuscript lay. The pages before me were no longer simply written in strange symbols, but they had begun to move. The ink had congealed and reformed, twisting into grotesque shapes, seemingly alive, as though the very paper itself were a sentient being writhing in agony. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my pulse thundered in my ears, deafening me to the faintest murmur of the world outside. Yet, despite the overwhelming terror that had seized my heart, my hands, against my will, moved toward the manuscript. Perhaps it was the influence of the nameless forces that had taken root in my mind, or perhaps some sickening curiosity that I could no longer resist. I found myself reading the text aloud, the foreign words slipping from my tongue in a guttural chant that seemed to distort the air around me. Alhura, not dead, not yet, waiting beneath the stars, in the folds of space and time. The words made no sense, but they felt true. The reality I had known, the safe and predictable universe of science and reason, was disintegrating before my eyes. The walls of the study seemed to ripple and blur, as though they were mere projections of some greater, incomprehensible design. The air around me grew thick with an oppressive energy, and I could sense, with a clarity that chilled me to the marrow, that something was watching me. Not in the way a person might observe an insect under a microscope, but in a far more intimate, predatory manner. I turned abruptly, seeking refuge in the familiarity of the room, my gaze fixated on the door. But there was no door. In its place was a vast blackness that swallowed all light, as though it were a rift, an opening into the very fabric of the cosmos. From that rift, a slow, guttural hum began to resonate, a deep and primal vibration that shook the air itself. And then I saw it. At first, it was nothing but a faint suggestion at the edge of my vision, a shape barely distinguishable from the dark. But as my eyes focused upon it, the shape solidified, an immense, shifting form that defied all logic. It seemed to be both present and absent at once, like a shadow cast upon a shadow, a shape composed of darkness itself. Its form was amorphous, yet undeniably vast, stretching upward like a mountain whose summit could not be seen. The texture of its presence was something like smoke, yet far colder, far more tangible. I recoiled in horror, but my body could not move. My legs were locked, my arms rigid at my sides, as though some invisible force were holding me captive. And in that moment of helplessness, I heard the voice again, not within my mind this time, but from the very depths of the void that had appeared in the room. Carver! It was a voice not made of sound, but of thought itself, like an idea thrust into my mind with the force of 1,000 revelations. Carver, you have awakened us. The eclipse is upon you. The stars have aligned, and we are here. You will witness the truth beyond truth. It was then that I saw the stars outside, for I had been too caught up in the presence of that alien thing to notice the sky. Through the shattered windows, the heavens themselves had darkened. The familiar constellations were no longer fixed in their appointed places. They had shifted, distorted, bending into impossible angles that rendered the very laws of astronomy null and void. A single black blot had begun to eclipse the moon, a black hole in the fabric of the universe itself, where there should have been light. And then I understood. The Alhura had not been merely watching humanity from afar. They were the true architects of our reality, the silent masters of existence. We were not the pinnacle of creation, but a temporary aberration, a brief flicker of consciousness in a universe that would one day devour itself. The eclipse, the event the professor had warned me about, was not a celestial occurrence. It was a cosmic awakening. The boundaries between our world and the one beyond had been irrevocably torn open, and in the dark void that had always existed just beyond the stars, the Alhura were waiting to return. I began to feel their thoughts touching mine again, their cold tendrils of awareness creeping through my mind like a slow, suffocating fog. Their ancient knowledge flooded my consciousness in a torrential wave. I saw the uncountable eons that had passed since their race had first glimpsed the primordial chaos, and I felt the awful truth settle upon my soul. The Alhura had no need for physical form, for their existence was that of pure thought, existing beyond time and space. They had shaped all that I knew, shaping me as a puppet to their designs, watching me now as a curious insect trapped within a glass jar. "Do you see, Carver?" The voice whispered once more, growing louder, more insistent. "Do you see what lies beyond the veil? The knowledge that has been hidden from you, from all of humanity." I could no longer deny it. The horror of what I had uncovered was too great to bear. I had glimpsed into the very heart of the cosmos, and what I had seen there was not a grand design, but a chaotic, suffocating void. A place where there was no meaning, no purpose, no future. And worst of all, I knew that I could never escape it. Chapter 5, Into the Void. The terror that enveloped me was absolute. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to run from the madness that had overtaken my mind and the unnatural presence that loomed before me. But there was nowhere to run. The walls of the study seemed to dissolve around me, and the room itself warped, twisting and distorting as though it were no more than a dream. A fleeting thought in the mind of a being far beyond my comprehension. In that moment, I felt the weight of my mortality. The years of rational inquiry, the belief that I was in control of my own destiny, crumbled to dust. I was but a fragile, insignificant creature in the face of the Alhura, beings whose very essence transcended all that I had ever known or understood. Their thoughts reached deep into my mind, unraveling my sanity with each passing second. I could feel myself slipping away, my identity becoming unmoored, as if I were being drawn into the very fabric of the void itself. The manuscript was still there, still open on the desk before me, and I reached for it again, my fingers trembling with a mixture of dread and desire. There was no turning back now. I had read its pages, and in doing so, I had sealed my fate. The text had not only unlocked the secrets of the Alhura, it had opened a doorway to their world, a world where time, space, and reality were mere illusions. As I touched the manuscript, the room was consumed by an explosion of sound, terrible, incomprehensible, an unearthly cacophony of voices, each one speaking in a language that tore at the very fabric of my mind. The blackness that had swallowed the room became a tangible force, a presence that pressed upon me from all sides. And then, in that overwhelming darkness, I felt my consciousness expand, spreading outward like the ripples on the surface of a vast, black sea. I was no longer confined to my body. I was something more, something less, adrift in the void, bound by nothing. It was then that I saw them, the Alhura, not as creatures but as thoughts, vast, infinite, and cold. Their forms were not forms at all, but ripples in the fabric of existence itself. Their consciousness bled into mine, and I realized with a final, soul-shattering clarity that I was but a fleeting moment in the span of infinity, a mere echo in the endless abyss. And I knew, with a certainty that defies all explanation, that the universe would never be the same. Chapter 6, The Shattered Mind. I cannot describe what happened next, for it is beyond words, beyond any concept of reality that I had ever known. My mind, shattered and broken, could not comprehend the enormity of what I had seen. There are no words for the horror of being one with the void, of touching the minds of beings who existed beyond time, beyond matter, beyond all things that we could ever hope to understand. But I can tell you this: I am not the same man I was when I first came to that accursed manor. I have seen what lies beyond the stars, and I know that humanity is but a fleeting dream in the mind of something older, far older, than the cosmos itself. The Alhura are eternal, and we are but insects in their gaze. And as the eclipse darkens the sky, I can hear their whispers in my mind once more. They are calling to me. They are calling to all of us. The stars will fall, the heavens will shatter, and when the darkness consumes all that we know, the Alhura will return to claim what is theirs. I have seen the end of everything, and it is only the beginning.